Hi, I'm Eric Petterson, and this is my Genius Hour Action Research presentation. I made my presentation on Prezi and my video on Screencast-O-Matic. I've made several videos on Screencast-O-Matic before, but this is my first presentation I made on Prezi. The question I'm focusing on for this project is how can I engage my students with my questioning and also with Genius Hour. What is Genius Hour? Genius Hour is also known as 20% time. It interested me because it allows students a chance to explore their passions. The idea came from Google's 20% time, in which Google allowed their employees an opportunity to work on projects they were passionate about 20% of their work time. Google found that by doing this, their productivity increased significantly. It's been reported that 50% of Google's new products came from this 20% time, including Gmail and Google Earth. When I first started this project, I had never heard of Genius Hour. The first video I saw on Genius Hour was a quick video explaining what it was. Shortly after that, I watched a TED Talks video by Dan Pink, where he explained how Google had used Genius Hour. My interest was piqued, so I started doing research. One of the top resources I found was a website or podcast called The Cult of Pedagogy. This is a podcast by Jennifer Gonzalez where I listened to 2 interviews with AJ Giuliani. In the first interview she did, Giuliani explained what Genius Hour was. In the second interview or podcast, he answered the top 10 Genius Hour questions people were asking. The more I learned about Genius Hour, the more I wanted to try it in my classroom. If you haven't heard either of these podcasts and are interested in Genius Hour, I highly recommend that you listen to both podcasts. I also read an article in Educational Leadership called The Genius of Design. This article was written by John Spencer. Spencer told the story of the first time he used Genius Hour in the classroom over 10 years ago. One important point he brought up was that it's okay to fail, and you will probably fail in several ways the first time you try it. On one side note, this is where action research will come in later in this presentation. Although Spencer's first project failed in many ways, he loved his Genius Hour because it empowered students to take learning into their own direction and allowed his students to focus on what they were interested in. One hint I got from this article was to make sure that students' Genius Hour questions align with the standards. I also started reading blogs on Genius Hour and reflecting on earlier readings. Math Johnson describes in this video what I want my classroom to look like. Another blog I looked at was one by Matt Oldrich. He used the Genius Hour question that I want to use in my math class. And he used a wonder wall where he brainstormed for ideas with the students. A previous reading I looked at was the one from Sir Ken Robinson. One thing he talked about is teachers should allow the students to find their passion and look for new approaches and ways of thinking. How does action research tie into Genius Hour? Action research in education is where teachers identify a problem or something that isn't working the way they would like in their classroom. After they identify the problem, they devise a plan and start acting on the plan. After they have acted on the plan for a while, they observe, collect, and analyze data on how their implementation worked. After this, they reflect and share what they learned before coming up with a new question to work on. Action research is cyclical, so it allows teachers to become more effective in their classroom. A couple of quotes that express this are as follows. The secret of success in the profession of teaching is to continually grow and learn. Action research is a way for you to continue to grow and learn by making your own experiences. This is a quote from an action research booklet by Francis Rust and Christopher Clark. Another quote I really liked on action research was this one. Action research helps educators become effective at what they care about most, their teaching and development of their students. This quote comes from Drawn from Science. So what do I want my classroom to look like, and how can I use Genius Hour? This is a question I've been drawn to for the last half of the summer. Last week we had training on a new math curriculum. Before this training, this project might have looked quite a bit different. As a teacher, I believe I've taught in a teacher-centered classroom. I want to change that to a student-centered classroom. It's not surprising that I teach the way I have. It's the way I learned, and it's what I'm used to. But I want my classroom to go from an I, we, you classroom to a we, you, I classroom. What do I mean by an I, we, you classroom? Well, that's where the teacher demonstrates, and then you have guided practice where the students and the teacher practice together, and then the students work on their own. I want to change that to a you, we, I classroom, where students explore and grapple and investigate the problem. Then teachers and students discuss the different strategies that were used. And last of all, the teacher connects work with previous math ideas. That would be at the end of the period. The reason I want to do that is because in closing the teaching gap, a reading we had earlier this year, they stated, in mathematics, we know that high-achieving countries succeed not by using particular methods, but by finding ways to engage students in sustained efforts to grapple with mathematical ideas and relationships. The National Council for Teaching Mathematics says it's slightly different, but in a very similar way. Teachers should encourage students to think, question, solve problems, and discuss their ideas, strategies, and solutions. A big focus for me this year is going to be on questioning. One way to do that is by asking focusing questions rather than funneling questions. I want to work on my wait time and ask questions to the whole group rather than to an individual, so everybody gets a chance to think about the question. I want both teachers and students asking questions and showing that my students are thinking. I want my questions to be thought-provoking so my students have to think rather than just recite factual answers. The last thing I want to talk about is my Genius Hour project I plan to use with my students this next year. At first I was planning to use Genius Hour early in the school year. That all kind of changed last week while going through the math training. After the training, I decided I really wanted to focus on having my students working in groups and my questioning strategies at the beginning of the year. I want to engage my students in making them think rather than recite. I decided to focus on this and the new book at the beginning of the year because by the end of April or May, in math we are testing. In the past, after all the testing was completed, I would have my students work on a road trip project. In this project, my students would budget and plan a road trip and present it on Google Slides. I always loved this project because students stayed engaged in math class until the end of the school year. 2 years ago, I left the 7th grade for the 8th grade. In the process, I left that project for the 7th grade teachers. The last 2 years, I've missed not having a project for students to work on at the end of the year, and my 8th grade students seem to have checked out as soon as the weather turned a little warmer. Last week at training, I found out that the teachers who used the new curriculum last year, that they finished the book about the middle of May. This seemed like a perfect time to introduce my Genius Hour project. The question I plan on asking came from Matt Aldridge's blog. The question is, what is something you always wondered that can be solved using mathematics? The thing I want to keep in mind is this project might not work the way I planned, and that's okay, because as a teacher, I'm also a learner, so I can reflect and make changes to it the following year. I want to end my project with a quote by Joe Bowler. And the quote is this: "There are two versions of math in the lives of many Americans. The strange and boring subject that they encountered in classrooms and an interesting set of ideas that is math of the real world, and is curiously different and surprisingly engaging. Our task is to introduce the second version to today's students, get them excited about math, and prepare them for the future." This quote and my experiences this summer have motivated me to try something different to become a better teacher.